We'll just give a minute or so as our participants join us today. We will just give a couple of more minutes and we can start. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining. Please let us know where you are joining from by introducing yourself in the chat. And a warm welcome to all of you to the webinar number 5 of the CGIAR Climate Impact webinar series. In this series, as you know, we try to capture emerging climate issues that are either new in terms of the scientific progress or have a high policy relevance for the work that we do within the CGIAR. This is primarily targeted at the CGIAR scientists, but we also welcome participation from around the world. So in this particular webinar today, I have a great pleasure in welcoming two excellent speakers whom I would introduce in a couple of minutes. And to give you a bit of a background about what this webinar will be about, we will be exploring particularly the methodologies and tools that are used to measure adaptation effectiveness and resilience. This is very important given the ongoing discussions that are going on in terms of the global goals on adaptation. And right now, there is also a call for submission to the global goals on adaptation around informing them about some of these indicators that can be included in that policy discussion. So today's speakers would bring insights from both how these adaptation effectiveness and resilience is measured in practical terms from the work that they are doing at IFAD, as well as the Global Environment Facility. So our speakers will share knowledge of tracking progress, identifying gaps, and refining strategies to enhance resilience. Today we have two speakers, and I have great pleasure in first introducing Dr. Jyotsna Puri. She is the Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge Department at IFAD, that's the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And she will discuss resilience credit, which is a very new concept that kind of is used to track adaptation effectiveness. During this conversation, Dr. Puri today will present the thinking behind using the data and evidence-driven index as the basis for monetizing resilience benefits. And then this will help us also to think through if some of this work can be somehow also used in the work that we do at the CGIAR with our local communities. I am also very delighted to present Professor Ed Carr, who is the Center Director and Senior Scientist at SEI USA, Stockholm Environmental Institute US. And he has been a member of the Science and Technical Advisory Panel of Global Environment Fund. And he will share the insights from GEF's adaptation portfolio. Ed will discuss the indicators used in global adaptation goals from the GEF portfolio and address challenges and importance of measuring adaptation. So with that, and without further ado, I think we have one slide that just very quickly on the engagement rules, do's and don'ts. I think we share it at every meeting, so it's kind of well known. If we can go to the next slide, please, Gina. Did we have the slide about the engagement rules? Anyway, introduce yourself in the chat. Ask your questions in the Q&A. Keep yourself muted when not speaking. And then we would have the question and answer session at the very end. So please raise your hand or put your question in the Q&A and we would take those questions at the end. And with that, I would pass on to Dr. Jyotsna Puri. Jo, you would have around 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Aditi. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay, I'm assuming yes. Thank you very much for having me here. It's such a pleasure and a huge privilege to be here, to be talking with you, with the CG, and with our counterparts across the world. I'm Jo Puri. I'm going to, as Aditi said, I'm going to be talking about resilience and really looking at the key question of why are we not seeing a lot of financing coming into adaptation. And a proposed way is to think about a market for resilience credits. And so I'm going to share a few slides on this and take you through a little bit of a journey on what we can do. So this is the title of my presentation is The Market for Resilience, Innovations in Measurement and Monetization. And as the name suggests, the overall idea of creating a market really is predicated on us being able to measure extremely well. And that's where my story starts. So, but first, let me get to resilience. And again, I'm speaking to the converted, but just to create a similar language amongst all of us. Resilience is the ability to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in an efficient, timely manner. Now, the important thing in this is to recognize that resilience can really occur in a whole variety of ways. And traditionally, what we've done is that we've seen that resilience is the outcome. If you were all theory of change thinkers, resilience is the outcome. But you can get to it through different pathways. You can invest in nutrition, food security, water security, basic services, credit, job security, wealth, income, create better networks, access to information, gender relations, empowerment, or a combination of one or many of these. Now, what this has really led to, unfortunately, is a fragmentation. And so, unfortunately, IFAD is an investor. And when we want to go and invest in resilience, if I go and speak to a water expert, they'll say, oh, yeah, but you need to have an indicator which really measures as to how well we are doing with respect to either water availability or water usage or quality of water or the ability to withstand water-related hazards, right? So it's very water-focused. If I go to someone who's working on gender, they speak about everything related to resilience and gender-related investments. But of course, the farmer or the person on the ground is not thinking of this sector or that sector. They're thinking of what is their overall ability to withstand or recover from a shock. And that's one of the key challenges, actually, that we're seeing, that there's been a huge amount of fragmentation on one side. But this has also led to a huge amount of fragmentation in the kinds of indicators, and therefore, one of the maintained hypotheses is also very little money coming into the adaptation space because everything is so divided by what are our traditional development sectors. So we want to think a little bit about investing in resilience and really to underscore what one of the key things is that I'm saying is that although we are seeing overall, and this was the data in 2019, 2020, 653 additional climate finance going in, most of this was going to mitigation. 586 billion out of the 653 billion was going to mitigation, and only 49 billion was going to adaptation. So this also creates the overall, this underscores or highlights essentially the pattern that we are seeing. And the idea is, again, not to belabor this, but really to say that there is a mismatch in climate finance for resilience overall. And a large part of this comes from, first, from information asymmetries. So that's asymmetry arising from knowledge gaps, different types of measurements, different kinds of fragmentation, climate change uncertainties, etc. The second is really constrained capacities. We're not seeing a lot of resources going into adaptation or resilience related. And yes, I should put this out up front. I'm using the word adaptation currently interchangeably with resilience, with the idea that an investment into adaptation leads to better resilience. Now, of course, we all know that they are different, but in the sense that one is one is the activity or the output, and the other one is essentially the outcome that we are seeing. But I'm currently, for the purposes of this presentation, using it interchangeably. Now, one of the other areas also, so yes, IFAD, for example, invests in adaptation, is that we are seeing that while we might have money for adaptation, actually bankable projects that can actually give me the risk and the return and the impact, the three variables that I'm really interested in, if I'm an investor, are very few. So that's the constrained capacity question. The third is there are lack of innovative financial mechanisms. So there is a perceived high riskiness of investing in areas that most require adaptation financing. And for those that know the space, there is both the adverse selection problem as well as the moral hazard problem, over and above the lack of the ability to pool risk and pool different kinds of financing. And then the last, but definitely not the least, is there are market-based complexities. So the fact is that adaptation, very much like any other public good, is non-excludable and non-divisible. And that's important, although, of course, in the carbon market area, we seem to have solved the problem, so to speak, of non-excludability and being a public good. But if we have time, we'll come back to this part. I should say that we did a review of what's been happening in the space, and after we are collaborating now with the Ministry of International Cooperation in Egypt as well as Duke University. And so there is a paper that I will also put on the link that we produced, which lays out some of the review of the literature. But the initial idea on resilience credits essentially comes from us at IFAD when we started to develop this almost 2 years ago. So measuring and monetizing resilience. And here the idea of a resilience credit is introduced, right? So resilience credits essentially requires measuring resilience benefits really well. So that being transparent and being credible. And then second, pricing it, right? So two things are important. First, measure well. Second, pricing. So just want to give you a very quick overview of what is the resilience dividend, right? So when we know that when a disruption occurs of a negative kind or a disturbance, we are looking at the ability of any community or people to adapt and to be resilient. The resilience dividend is the increased ability to respond and adapt over and above what would have happened anyway, right? So this dashed green line is the counterfactual, that is without any investment, and then the dividend is basically how much you've improved if you are able to invest in it. And then ultimately, of course, we want to see recovery. And the way to get to resilience is either reducing reducing the magnitude of disruption, extending the duration of resistance, reducing the duration of disruption, and reducing the duration of recovery of disruption. So or any of those or all of those could occur. And all of those would mean that you are making the population far more resilient than it would have been in the counterfactual. Now, what did we do? And your screens are going to go blank for a minute, but don't panic. Okay, so what did we do when we were looking at this? One of the things is that we started to try and understand as to how we could measure resilience in our own investment portfolio. And our investment portfolio of approximately $8.1 billion, which closed in 2021, we said, okay, we want to understand irrespective. So IFAD invests in agriculture and livelihoods and rural finance, rural institutions, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, social inclusion. So literally like 21 sectors that we invest in. And we know that either one or all of them or some combination will lead to improved resilience if the project is done well and if the basis of that project or the investment is done well. So we said, okay, how could we measure this ability to recover index? And for those of you interested, we lay this out in quite a bit of detail, but we essentially say that at the household level, there is a shock exposure, which is a product of either a dummy variable, which is one if you get the shock, and then severity, which is measured. And then we try and understand the household's own perceived ability to recover, whether they are worse off, same as before, better than before. this is measured at the household level. But we also then aggregate it at the community level. And we disaggregate these kinds of shocks, and we ask these questions for 22 different kinds of shocks: macroeconomic, climate-related, non-climate related. So across 22 such shocks. But the key thing is that we also try and measure this. This gives us a measure not just of the individual household's own ability to recover, for which their income might be a good proxy, but also the impact of also their social network, right? So if I have a strong social network, then my ability to recover is improved, and that also gets measured as a consequence of the measure that we've introduced, right? So then we essentially did so these are approximately 22 sites, right? And for those of you who know that this is a meta-analysis or a forest plot of, and each row essentially is the effect size of the investment on resilience over and above what would have happened anyway, right? So for example, in the second last row, we have Kenya. This diamond is showing that my effect size is to the right of the line of unity. It's positive. The standard error is large, but it is not intersecting the line of unity. That means my odds ratio, the likelihood of success, is greater than the likelihood of failure. Now, if you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. What you need to know are two things from this slide. First, that we got an aggregate effect size. That is, we pulled all of this data and then we re-estimated whether across all of our sites there was an ability to recover which was positive or not, and what the standard error is. And that diamond is showing you that aggregate effect size, which is positive and it's well measured. And we found the average effect size across our portfolio is 14%. That is, we use the meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis is done for $1.1 billion of investments. And then we extrapolated it to the $8.1 billion because these were randomly selected projects, and we were able to measure it and therefore extrapolate it. Okay, so this then essentially gives us some confidence that, okay, we are able to, and as you can imagine, these sites are very different, right? The interventions that we're doing in Papua New Guinea is different from Mauritania, is different from Peru, is different from Bolivia, is different from Nigeria. So really in Nigeria, our key investment is value chains, but in Lesotho, our key investment is livestock related. And in Mauritania, it's again livestock related, but in Solomon Islands is very, very different. So you can imagine that this is, that we are being pathway agnostic, but we are really looking at the outcome, which is ability to recover, which is our measure of resilience. Now, with Duke and with MOIC, we then looked at, oh, well, there must be other measures, obviously, of resilience as well. And on the left-hand side, you can see some of the measures that have been used by international organizations, by academia, and also by the private sector, for example, by Acumen, etc. And I don't need you to understand all of the slides, except to sort of say that, look, we then did Duke actually did the assessment for us and said, okay, how well are these indicators doing with respect to intuitiveness, parsimony, as well as customization? And they graded all these indicators. And essentially what we found is that the ability to recover index, so this is this one, does pretty decently with respect to all of those indicators, with all of those sort of criteria. It's relatively more intuitive, but less intuitive than, say, community-based resilience, but in terms of customization, we can do pretty well as well. Okay, so then this takes me into the resilience credits idea, right? The idea is to create a resilience credit financing market, and I'm just finishing 2 more slides, sorry, where IFAD comes in to essentially invest through a financing mechanism through intermediaries and supports, SHF stands for smallholder farmer, right? Supports intermediaries and local banks who then lend to smallholder farmers who, after getting that money from local banks, are able to make resilience-related investments, right? So that essentially says that the important thing is that as a consequence of our ATR index, we are able to measure the improvement in the smallholder farmer resilience, who, because they become more resilient, are able to repay the loan, who are in turn able to repay IFAD or any other investor that's coming in. The important thing is that we can put it in the context of a resilience credit investor. A resilience credit investor is someone who's really interested in buying each credit that is improving resilience. And I'll talk about that very briefly, but essentially a resilience credit investor, instead of others coming in, will invest in a resilience credit aggregator or a marketplace who then lend on to the smallholder farmer who make the improvement in resilience. But these farmers are therefore able to pay back what has been loaned to them, because the resilience credit investor is essentially interested in this market, because the smallholder farmer is able to sell that resilience credit to the resilience credit investor. So essentially, the market looks, very much like this, where we've got the resilience credit investor as well as local intermediaries working together. Now, the important question in all of this is, can we put a price to this? And the idea is really trying to find out, and this is the stage where we are at, what is the financial value of the investment to the farmer so that it improves his or her resilience? That is, what is their willingness to pay? What is the measurable for the RC investor or the resilience credit investor? What is the benefit to them? For the aggregator, it is really important to understand as to how much they are able to finance farmers and act as the intermediary to purchase the resilience credit. And for the international organization, that would be the market maker and the partial risk underwriter, the importance is understanding how much this additionality can really contribute to their overall remit. So the value add of resilience credits is really in recognizing this idea that, yes, a resilience credit will be able to address market vulnerability, is a market-based approach, can be standardized, it is reducing the asset risk and can also cover corporate social responsibility, is amenable to third-party verification, is household-centered. Right now, we're in the idea stage, and we are essentially collaborating with others. So the way forward is really to announce the full concept during COP29 and hopefully link it also with the global goal on adaptation. We are currently thinking of pilot testing it with a few. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure my colleagues have a number of questions. I certainly have a couple that I'll kind of keep till the end of the Q&A. Though very quickly, do you anticipate these values to be, given that many of the farming operations are not super profitable, the profit margins are smaller, so do you expect these margins to be very small of the resilience credit, and do you anticipate a high transaction costs?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Aditi. I mean, the early anticipation is that much like carbon credits, that there will be a voluntary market for this, right? And the voluntary or the pilot market is essentially where we have investors putting a value on how much they value additional resilience, not so much the farmers themselves. And the investors themselves are valuing the additional resilience because it protects their investment. And second, it also helps them to look better. That is, they're helping resilience on the ground. But overall, if you are able to show that you're protecting, say, value chains that are global value chains and improving food supply, then that should be a bragging-worthy credit to them. So that's essentially the very voluntary market, which is how we anticipate it will start and then later become compliance.
Right, right. No, that's absolutely fascinating. And please keep your questions in Q&A. We will get to that towards the end, the last 15 minutes of our webinar today. But now I wanted to invite Vanessa to quickly, now that we have we had listened to Joe and have had some time to process what these resilience credits are and what does ability to recover measure. We have a Slido question just trying to understand what you think could be the applicability of this work in some of the work that the CG does. can this concept that Dr. Joe Puri just talked to us be adopted in any of the work that we are doing? If so, where and how? We would keep it open for maybe a couple of minutes, but this poll would be open till the end of this webinar. So at any point, please keep answering. While this has been answered, we do have a few questions, Joe. Perhaps you would like to answer them. We have Shreya Chakraborty asking, what are we using as the baseline for estimating effects against?
Yeah, great question, Shreya. So the idea is that the baseline is really determined because we know we need to create a counterfactual, right? So the counterfactual is against what we are measuring the overall additional change in resilience. And so for many people actually, or for many organizations that forget to have a baseline, I mean, frankly, in a perfect world, I would have baseline and baseline for both the intervention area and the counterfactual area, and then end line for both areas, and then sort of do a double difference, right? But in many cases, what happens is that you don't actually create those baselines, or many people forget. But there are ways around it, and we're just going to be publishing a paper on this as well, which help you to first look at physiographic factors and really understand as to what the baseline is. But even if you can't do that, you can look at the counterfactual areas that have been created with a high level of balance. This balance idea is balance in trends and balance in levels. So it's an econometric principle, but I can explain that later. And really to see as to what difference or additionality we're bringing out vis-a-vis counterfactual areas. This is not so new, actually, because this is also done in, for example, MRVs for RED Plus projects. Thanks.
Yeah. No, that's what, when we were discussing, that's what was, I constantly kept thinking around RED Plus. So yes, so this is great. And in the meanwhile, keep answering this Slido question. These could be certainly tested in living labs and other place-based research settings. It can probably be operationalized in the context of green credits, especially in paddy greenhouse gas reduction with technologies like alternate wetting and drying and direct seeded rice. So yes, let's keep thinking about how this can be something we at the CG can benefit from and use. In the meanwhile, I just wanted us to move to the second presentation of Professor Ed Carr. In the meanwhile, do keep your questions in the Q&A so that we have all the questions at the same place. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Carr to talk about how adaptation effectiveness has been measured in the GEF projects that he has been studying. So over to you, Ed, again, 15 minutes. Thank you.
There we go. I had to turn on my audio. Thanks, Aditi. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to take a step back, but I think that my presentation actually resonates a lot with some of the things you just heard. And I want to point out that I am going to talk about insights from thinking about the GEF's adaptation portfolio. We don't have a lot of insights from that portfolio because we haven't actually done that much analysis of it. But let me jump forward, and if I can, there we go. We have a fundamental problem, I think, in the measurement of adaptation and adaptation impact, and that is the fundamental question of what does adaptation do? We don't tend to ask that question much, and so sometimes the response you get is it helps people adapt, which is tautological and therefore not a terribly helpful answer. What we're having trouble with is a foundational understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve with adaptation action. This sets adaptation a bit separate from mitigation. Mitigation side, it's pretty simple. In the end, the goal is less greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, and that can be measurable in any number of ways. The way you get there, of course, is incredibly complex and locally specific and challenging. In the adaptation community, there is no overarching goal that really lines up the same way with less greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And frankly, the local specificity of adaptation, which of course is completely true and real, has become one of the reasons why, or at least a stated reason why, we don't have one of those broader goals, because adaptation is specific to socioecologies, to when you're adapting, for how long you intend to adapt, and of course, even things like the politics of particular areas. Of course, all of that is also true of mitigation. So that maybe is not the best reason for us to be avoiding, I would argue, avoiding a serious conversation about how to think broadly about adaptation benefits. And so in a response and some sort of frustration with this situation, my colleague Johanna Nalu and I sat down after the last IPCC cycle and said, what would we do if we were to try to talk about what adaptation does and how we think about adaptation benefits? And we said, look, the first thing you need is just a simple typology of benefits, things that would be derived from adaptation actions. And we said, why not just use the typology that everybody already understands, the components of adaptation risk as we understand them. So an adaptation action ought to be doing one or more of the following: reducing your exposure to a climate hazard, reducing your sensitivity to the impacts of that hazard, or increasing your adaptive capacity to either adapt to some sort of impact or hazard, or to take advantage of emerging opportunities that do come sometimes from climate change. When we start doing this, it gives us an opportunity to build sort of theories of change, or what you might call adaptation rationales, that actually help us understand what's going on with adaptation portfolios, actions, and outcomes. And just to give you a sense of what these benefits might look like, this is actually from a GEF project. You had a stakeholder priority at one end of this, which is mostly the GEF's priority for early warning systems and improved land management. That was manifest in this project through three different kinds of intervention. You see here: flood early warning, seasonal forecasts, and climate smart land management. Each of those interventions was going to deliver benefits that could be organized under this typology, right? So flood early warning can provide an exposure benefit if it gets people out of the way of floods, and that's a direct benefit. Seasonal forecasts give people a sensitivity benefit, mostly. That is, they help people understand what they ought to be planting if you're in an agricultural area, and how that can therefore deal with whatever the oncoming season is going to bring. At the same time, it often delivers a co-benefit of increased adaptive capacity, because farmers learn how to use those forecasts and they start thinking differently about agriculture, which allows them to think differently about their livelihoods and practices in a changing climate. And then you see climate smart land management, which of course can deliver itself a sensitivity benefit, particularly if you're, say, working on soil quality, that allows you to deal better with variations in precipitation. And that too, similar to the way that seasonal forecasts do, can deliver an adaptive capacity co-benefit. That's pretty useful right away, because that lets you start seeing, right, what was the intended goal of this project? What was it supposed to be doing? What benefit was supposed to be delivering? It's supposed to be delivering an exposure benefit and a sensitivity benefit, and it's also going to deliver an adaptive capacity co-benefit. And then you can start to think about measuring things under that. This gets really useful for a number of different reasons. And we're really talking about a fundamental organizational tool here. I'm not talking about how to measure with this tool. I'm simply talking about how to organize things so that we can actually start measuring in a meaningful way. One of the things this will let you do is do portfolio analyses. Whether you are a donor organization, you may be an implementer, or you're, say, a country level organization, or a country itself, you can actually use this typology of benefits to figure out what adaptation services benefits, I should say, you are delivering over time. And so you can see here at the bottom, this is looking at the GEF 4 portfolio and the GEF 7 portfolio. Some colleagues of mine and I went through all of the project information documents that they set up at the beginning. They have not yet evaluated all of this work, so we can't talk about outcomes, but we can talk about intended benefits here. And one of the things you can see is between GEF 4 and GEF 7, a pretty big swing in how the Least Developed Countries Fund goes about thinking about delivering adaptation benefits. Under GEF 4, you can see a lot of attention being given to sensitivity benefits and to exposure benefits as the direct outcomes of projects, with adaptive capacity being sort of a co-benefit that emerges a lot. What you can see by GEF 7 is that adaptive capacity has become sort of the target of most of the GEF's work, with very little attention or less effort at going straight at exposure, and a little bit of a shift in drop in direct efforts to get at sensitivity. Now, that is not a statement of whether or not the GEF has made a good decision. That is simply something that allows the GEF to look at its portfolio and say, wait, we have shifted over time. Why did we make that shift? Does that shift follow best practices? Does that shift follow institutional learning? Or is this a random shift? And then that's a question we should be asking ourselves then about, is that the best way to deliver the impacts that we need to see? The other thing that you get when you start to organize around a typology of benefits is you can build strong adaptation rationales within projects. Again, adaptation rationales are just theories of change that link a priority, an institutional priority, to an intervention, to an expected benefit that comes out at the other end. I have been evaluating GEF projects for 4.5 years. I just stepped off the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the GEF. I used to work at USAID. I have seen dozens and dozens and dozens of project proposals. The vast majority have very weak adaptation rationales. That is, they just don't link this together very coherently. And that's a tremendous problem because it means that we can't really understand the mechanisms by which we expect to deliver these outcomes, so we can't evaluate if they're happening, and we can't learn from what does and doesn't happen. And so this slide here just gives you a little bit of an illustration. You can see, again, a least developed countries fund theme within a particular project. There's 3 of them that you see there. These are materialized in a particular intervention. By just setting up an adaptation rationale like this, you can start asking fundamental questions, both at the project design level, but also then at project evaluation at the end. Why was this priority translated into this particular kind of intervention? Was this appropriate and effective to do this? From the intervention out to the adaptation benefits that you can see there, we can now, by clearly articulating what we think those benefits are, start to ask, did the intervention actually deliver sensitivity and adaptive capacity benefits? Were there enough benefits to matter? Were the benefits meaningful? And that actually allows us a last loop that you see at the top there, where we can say, wait, can we actually look at this overall portfolio and see if least developed countries funds themes within a cycle of the GEF actually result in the delivery of adaptation benefits, and then what benefits are being delivered by these different cycles of the GEF. This also enables you to dive real deep into the GEF portfolio or to any portfolio and start to learn about what's going on and why it's been happening, or at least to give you the tools to start asking those questions in a meaningful way. This is a chart right here of ecosystem-based adaptation interventions that are used to achieve sensitivity benefits, comparing the GEF 4 cycle to the GEF 7 cycle. And again, what you can see here is a shift over time. For example, a massive growth in ecosystem rehabilitation in GEF 7, and then a real shrinkage in water management when compared to, say, GEF 4. The question here, again, is not whether or not that's good. I can't answer that. That's an institutional question in some ways. But did they even know this happened? And if they did know this happened, why was it happening? Because again, is this following good practice? Is this following some sort of shift institutionally in terms of politics or something along those lines? But until we can see this sort of thing, we can't even ask those questions, nor can we learn from the experiences of the projects that implemented these. Finally, the thing that I find really interesting here, and something I just completed as for my last act on the Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel, was to look at the non-adaptation portfolio of the GEF. For those who are not deeply familiar with the GEF, it is a complex beast. You have the main trust fund, which covers, biodiversity, land degradation, climate change mitigation, and chemicals waste, international waters. Then you have the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. They sit in a separate trust fund. And those who are familiar with the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, that is now a third trust fund. The challenge here is that these trust funds don't get easily mixed in GEF projects. And generally, they have their own priorities. We all know this. Everything lives in stovepipes. So adaptation doesn't show up as a priority in the main trust fund. But we wanted to look at the main trust fund and say, is adaptation work happening, even if it's not intended to, not designed into the project? And by using that adaptation benefits typology and looking at the interventions and their expected outcomes within that typology, we were able to kind of go through the different focal areas within the trust fund. And as it turns out, yes, this is from GEF 8, the current cycle. We're only halfway through. This only represents about, I'd say, a third of the projects we're likely to see in GEF 8. But you can already see that we have adaptation benefits being delivered by projects that are not even adaptation projects. This is incredibly important for 2 reasons. From one institutional perspective, you might say, hey, we're not taking credit for things that we're actually doing that are good in the world. From another perspective, I'm not evaluating here whether or not these adaptation benefits that are being delivered actually work very well. I'm simply pointing out that these could be adaptation benefits that show up, but they could also result in maladaptation because people haven't consciously thought through whether or not they meant to be delivering this type of benefit and whether or not it makes sense in that particular context. So to wrap this up, I have a plea for everyone, which I think lines up pretty strongly with some of the things you heard earlier. The first is we have to measure. We have to measure adaptation. We have to measure it meaningfully. A global goal on adaptation that is as vaguely worded as the one we've been living under, and adaptation gap that talks about large amounts of money that are needed without explaining what that money is needed for, simply isn't moving the adaptation conversation forward. We need to start demanding adaptation rationales from projects and portfolios. Frankly, that is not done. Again, I've seen an awful lot of money, about $500 million, actually closer to $1 billion worth of funding go out the door in projects, and it's just not happening. We need people to link their priorities to interventions to expected outcomes, and they need to do this extremely clearly at the project level. I would argue these need to be anchored in some sort of typology of benefits to be delivered that is generalizable beyond the project. It doesn't have to be the typology that Johanna and I put out there. You could develop your own at an institutional level, but simply it has to be the kind of thing that can capture these outcomes in larger buckets and thus allow you to start looking across your portfolio at what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the outcomes you're getting for it. The other thing that I'm going to plead for here is the need to measure actual adaptation action. Coming out of the last IPCC cycle, I was a lead author for Working Group 2. I was incredibly frustrated with some of the statements around adaptation, what we've accomplished, what our impacts are, how effective it is. Bluntly, the vast majority, actually, I'd say all of the stuff captured in Working Group 2 came out of the academic literature. The academic literature, and I was an academic until March, so I'm kind of, I guess, criticizing myself as much as anyone. The academic literature is predominantly, when you get into the level of detail that I'm talking about here in terms of impact, it's based on case studies. These are not randomly selected case studies. Academics tend to be critical in our approach. As a result, we tend to look for projects that didn't work out the way we thought they would. So this is non-random. Actually, I would argue bias sampling towards things that didn't work out very well. And it's not representative of actual adaptation out in the world, or for that matter, potentially not representative of maladaptation out in the world, because we're not actually looking at projects and project documents. We're looking at very specific academic studies. So we need to step back, really start looking across these huge portfolios of investment that have been happening across any number of multilateral and bilateral organizations that have been put into adaptation over the last 20 or so years to really understand what we have and haven't accomplished. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ed. And I must say that I also kind of shared the frustration around the adaptation work in the Working Group 2. And I think what we ended up saying, because of the limitation of the literature, is like a lot of our chapters ended up talking about benefits of adaptation, but we could not go the next step to say whether adaptation was actually effective in reducing climate risk. And I think there still remains a big gap in our knowledge that perhaps is the time for the next couple of years to build up that knowledge base of, are we doing adaptation well enough to reduce our climate-related risk? And that's where I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So that was an excellent one, starting with at least the typology of what those benefits could be. And then I think linking with some of the work that Joe does is kind of monetizing those benefits in terms of So I could basically see a lot of connections between the two of your presentations, and I hope our audience sees the same. So we'll hold on the questions for a minute. I think we have questions coming up in the Q&A that I would read out presently, but we did have another Slido poll for audience interaction. And this one is, so yes, if we can go to the next one. And I hope, at CGIAR, we have 15 centers, and a lot of our work is precisely around building resilience and adaptation. So I'm just curious about what kind of indicators have we been using to measure effectiveness, or have we been doing those measurements at all? I know a lot of our work is also about reach. So we have a very big initiative that measures the number of people we reach with our climate information services, but do we also measure effectiveness? So if any one of you has any insights around some of these indicators and how we are measuring effectiveness, this is the time to put your thoughts in. And while you keep doing that, maybe I can open the floor for Q&A. This Slido will remain open for some time. Yeah, stability of production, yes, in the face of climate hazard, if still production remains the same with and without a hazard, then perhaps that shows that there's some adaptation has happened and that has been effective. We'll just keep it open for a minute or so, but in the meanwhile, while you are answering the questions, I would ask a few to Ed. We have a question by Susanna Fisher. Hi, Susanna. This is, how did you identify the adaptation benefits in non-adaptation projects? This is for you, Ed.
Sure. So the way we did this is all of the GEF's documents are public. You sometimes have to dig through them, but you can find them. In this particular case, especially GEF 8, we're not talking about outcomes. We're talking about intended benefits. So we went into the project information forms, the PIFs, as they're called in the GEF. We pulled all of those down, downloaded all of them, and we actually had to read them all. And we read them all, looking for the interventions that they were planning, and to the extent they either stated this or it was very clearly implied, looked at the impact that was intended from that intervention. And so you can imagine, for example, a land degradation intervention could also, if it's being done, say, in an agricultural area, be delivering an adaptation benefit. For example, reducing the sensitivity of farmers to fluctuations in precipitation. So we would then kind of organize it that way. We would identify that particular benefit in that manner. And then we sort of captured all of that across the portfolio and then started to kind of try to total up the number of benefits that we saw. Again, this is not a measurement in terms of the number of beneficiaries. We did not try to capture the amount of money that went into any of this. We were simply trying to organize the portfolio so that other kinds of measurement could happen in a meaningful way.
Right. Thanks, Ed. We have one more question from my colleague, Andrea Novak. And Andrea, you might also want to paste your paper today that was published in Nature Climate Change around indicators for Africa for this audience. But Andrea is asking, are you aware of any existing work on systematically mapping these typologies of benefits to interventions in the food and ag sector? Compared to, yeah.
At least from my side, no, but I don't see this being, at least in terms of adaptation, we don't see this necessarily happening anywhere, which is why we sort of wrote the paper. This is one of these moments where Johanna and I spent a lot of time kind of saying, really, no one wrote this yet. And then it doesn't happen often in academia, but it hadn't sort of happened yet. So no, I mean, there are obviously different organizations have different typologies of indicators, that sort of thing. But in terms of thinking about it in terms of typologies of benefits under which you would organize indicators and measurements, no, we have not seen that.
Right. Thanks, Ed. If you have more questions, and we both Ed and Joe have been pasting some of their work in the chat, have a look. Can we remove the Slido poll screen from here while you continue putting your Slido one? So let me just, I am not sure if I can spotlight both of you. I'm just trying. Add spotlight. Does it work? Yes, that works. Okay, excellent. So we have a few more questions that came your way, Joe, earlier today, but in the chat, I have copied them here. One question from my colleague Tech Subquota is, given the interest in adaptation and mitigation synergy, are there any attempts to design a credit framework that combines resilience and mitigation credit into a single system?
Yeah, great question. Actually, with the resilience credits idea, we could very well think of something that combines carbon and resilience credits, because carbon is really about, you know, when you're looking at the carbon market, you're essentially saying, well, how much carbon are we sequestering? And there are lots, and you know, Ed's presentation talks about that. There are projects that are not targeting adaptation, but they are targeting, say, mitigation and many others. But you are going to have the unintended benefit of, say, adaptation or increased resilience. Now, with the methodology that we put up, which is the ability to recover and respond, but where you have the counterfactual, you can essentially do it for any kind of project, even if it's not designed for adaptation and or mitigation, because you're looking at a counterfactual where the counterfactual site or sites have been chosen in a way that there is balance. You can then see, well, did our investment make a big difference to mitigation? Did it make it to adaptation? Did it make a big difference to development? I mean, there was another question about poverty as well. So you can basically have a whole spectrum of indicators and essentially compare versus your counterfactual and see as to whether that is improved or not. But the key thing is really the two things that both Ed and Aditi are talking about, which is measurement, 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 and how do you establish the additionality of the investment that you're making over and above what would have happened anyway, right? And this is why using counterfactuals is really important, because that's the only way you can really show the financial, social, climatic, environmental additionality that is going on with any investment. And that is what I want to stress. Thanks.
Right, yes. No, that's like, yeah, exactly. Like, would it's basically establishing the counterfactual. Would this have also happened without this investment having taken place? I think that's absolutely crucial. So we
and
have
also, sorry, I know Ed's hand is on. Just one, the point that Ed was making about maladaptation, right? The thing is, with this, you can also try and understand that, oh yeah, in some areas we made an improvement, but for example, in adaptation, we did not, and it was actually maladaptive, because you're able to compare this with the counterfactual, right? And that's really important. So I said this in the Q&A, actually for several of our projects, we found that our investment was not doing better than the counterfactual. That means it was probably better for us not to have gone in than what we did. And so, but at a portfolio level, we were able to show a net positive increase. So that's what is important. The investment needs to be at the portfolio level. Thanks.
Yes. And also kind of a testimony to the fact that not all adaptation would always have a positive impact, because I mean, so many things will not work. It will be a trial and error. So yes, over to you, Ed. You had a point.
Yeah, I'm just really interested in what Joe's talking about, because I think Joe's going right at one of the most challenging things I see in the space right now, which is, if I put it sort of crudely, how does one make adaptation or resilience monetizable? Because that's, except for insurance, we don't have a lot of models for that, and in fact, basically none. And I've talked to people who try to run these funds, and as best I can tell, some of these private funds are basically converting public money into private money, but I'm not sure they're doing anything on adaptation. So there's some weird stuff happening there. But Joe, I'm actually really interested in this intersection of sort of mitigation, where we do know there are markets and things going on, and then sort of the sort of work you're trying to build up. Because of course, if we were to connect those, as was suggested in that question, trade-offs immediately start up, right? And since I would imagine a resilience credit isn't going to be the same per unit, whatever that unit is, as a mitigation credit, like, you're going to start getting all these weird effects as you start to pull these together in a project, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't, in fact, I think we should talk about this. This is really interesting, but it's really hard to do this without measurements, without organization, that kind of thing.
This is so exciting, because I actually think that the key thing that policymakers have to deal with is trade-offs, right? If there were win-win-wins, we would have done it already, right? So, but the key thing is that, yeah, there are going to be, and this is the crux of the just transition debate, right? Yeah, you're telling everyone to move away from coal. Sorry for saying this, especially in this space, but the fact is that you're moving away from coal, but that also means that there are some people who are becoming non-resilient as a consequence. So the key question is, what is the magnitude of that change? Because you need that to be armed with the question of what is the trade-off and what, if any, is a compensation mechanism. But unless you know magnitudes of change, you're never going to be able to answer that question. Over. So I completely agree.
That's great. We have some questions that were there earlier for you. Is actually establishing the counterfactual was such a bane for things like RED Plus. So how do you make it easy? I mean, it's not easy establishing counterfactual. You are an economist and you know better than most of us here. So
look, I'm not saying that this is costless or it's easy, no? but anything we're doing is going to require some investment. But the thing, okay, let me go back to the 1930s when the first big banking crisis occurred. Right before that, we had no constant standardized way of understanding the health of firms. Everybody used their own accounting framework. And then the great crash occurred. And then everybody said, oh no, we've got to invest in a standard accounting process. And yes, it will require money. We spent thousands and millions of dollars on auditors and on risk assessors. So you've got to spend money if you really want to get something out of, doing something about climate change and a just transition. Please start measuring better and start investing in it. So it's not going to be costless, but data is and technology is helping us. What used to take me, $500,000 earlier can be done now with literally $25,000. So you've got to also look at where technology and data has come to in terms of rapid access, easy measurement, and high disaggregability. Thanks.
Right.
And can I just jump in? And a cultural change around valuing counterfactuals, which is so hard to get people to take seriously, because it didn't happen, so it didn't happen. So now I don't have to pay for it. But it's like it didn't happen because someone invested somewhere and did something. No, we have to pay for this. This is not, again, with the exception of insurance, we just don't do very well in counterfactual thinking. So I think there's also a cultural component that goes along with everything Joe's talking about.
I love that comment.
Yes, exactly. And which it means that we have to do what we can to actually overcome some of those barriers. And Lou has a question around credible counterfactual. That's hard to do, but what I'm hearing is it's still worth doing. I think otherwise, then we kind of remain. I mean, many of the things we now measure is how many farmers we have reached through our advisory services. We reach numbers of 2.5 to 3 million. That's in our annual reports, but that's not somehow good enough. So we have to do the next step to see that whether, reaching them actually led to any material difference in their lives, were they better adapted to the climate risks. So no, that's important. And as we move on to designing our own new climate portfolio at the CGIAR, I think this is a very important discussion of how do we actually go about doing a credible measurement of the impact of our investments on these smallholder farmers that we work with. So we have around 3 minutes left. I do not see many questions out there. There is one by Krishna who is asking around carbon credits, implementing carbon credits. Well, I think the context of his question is making carbon credits work for smallholder farmers, again, has been incredibly hard, partly because of the baseline, partly because of the measurements and MRVs, everything put together. So I think a parallel is those same issues will come in resilience credit. How would you actually look at overcoming those?
My quick line on this, recognizing that we have 2 minutes, is please learn from the carbon markets experience. Build in benefit sharing right at the beginning into the DNA of resilience credits, because we know that building two big things into resilience credits. One, credibility. What the carbon credits market is suffering from currently is essentially this, carbon washing or greenwashing or whatever you want to call it. And that's because we have not paid attention to the details of how to measure. And we've just thought, oh yeah, we can do it. And now you can shop around depending on what your cost structure is on any kind of carbon credits. That's not good enough. So credibility is super important. And the second is please put into the DNA of any system equity. Benefit sharing is really key, and it has to be done with a huge amount of diligence and advocacy right at the beginning. Over.
Yeah, great answer. Is there anything, Ed, you wanted to add as we near the end of our conversation today?
Just to say, I love Joe's last comment, because I think that is actually the mechanism in the end where you're going to get things to work on the ground. If you don't have that sort of equity component built in, what is the incentive for anyone to participate? I think the only other thing I'd say along with it is, once again, we're talking about big systems changes. So we need to be prepared to learn a lot as we're doing this kind of work, to adjust as we go, and frankly, to fail sometimes. ideally without harming the people at the bottom level of all of these markets. But at the same time, if we're not failing at all in what we're setting up, we're not trying hard enough. I mean, that is really clear to me. We have, I was part, and Aditi, you were part of a working group too. We're out of incremental pathways into a sort of just and sustainable future. It's all transformational now. And transformational by definition is uncertain. So I really do think that we need to start taking somewhat larger chances. And so I'm actually excited about the kind of stuff that Joe's talking about. I think this is a really interesting idea, and it's something we ought to give some attention to. Will it work? I don't know, but that's the point. We try and we learn. Hopefully it works. And if it doesn't work, we learn why and we do better the next time. But I think that's an overall attitude we really need to start adopting right now.
Right. Well, that's a great way to end today's one, that we have to try and we need to measure better. And we really need to care about the end result of whether we are building resilience of our constituencies, whosoever it may be. For the CGIAR, it's our smallholder producers, to the climate risk. So basically centering the outcomes that are they better adapted to climate change is what should drive a lot of the work that we are doing. So we have a few more questions, which I think we have run out of time to answer, but yeah, so they were around some ethical concerns around RCTs and control groups, etc. But I think there's a wide literature about how to overcome some of those. So I'll just leave it at that. And we are at the end of our webinar today. I think this was a very useful one, and very useful as we design, as I said, our new portfolio of how do we measure adaptation going forward. Join us for our next month's webinar, which will again focus on the global goals on adaptation, and we would have one negotiator and one speaker from the civil society talking to us about the current political discussions around the GGA and how some of the science that we do can influence those discussions. So stay tuned for the next webinar. And thank you again, Dr. Puri and Professor Carr, for these wonderful presentations today.
Thank you so much, Aditi.
For the entire CGIAR. Yes.
Ed, lovely to see you.
Yes, nice to see you as well. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.